So, Moment. Mhm. Jetzt bin ich gespannt, ob man jetzt den Ton hören kann, weil ich buchstäblich noch mal 'n Schalter umgelegt habe am Ausgang. Vielleicht ist jetzt irgendwas hörbar, wenn ich einfach weiterrede und so tue, als würde das Sinn ergeben. So, fangen wir noch mal an. Mal schauen, ob gleich Ton kommt. Das hat immer so 'n bisschen Verzögerung. Da muss man dann, ich glaube, 3, 4 Sekunden warten. Passt? Okay.
Ja, das machen wir. Genau.
Ah, genau. Und auch in Präsentation zum Beispiel. Genau, super. Und ich gehe einfach mit den Pfeiltasten. Ja.
Pfeiltasten oder klicken bitte auch. Genau. Genau. USB-Stick?
Danke. Stecke ich gleich wieder ein.
Okay. Und sonst haben wir alles, ne?
Alles, glaube ich. Ja.
Sehr gut.
Vielen Dank.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of our midterm conference here, there, and somewhere in between, placing, practicing, and configuring. It's the midterm conference of the DFG-funded research training group, Practicing Place, Sociocultural Practices, and Epistemic Configurations. I'm Kerstin Schmidt. I'm in the faculty of that group and speaker of the program. But this morning, it is my great pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker. It is my colleague, Antje Klei, Professor Dr. Antje Klei. She is chair of American Studies, focusing on literary studies at the University of Erlangen, Friedrich-Alexander-Universität Erlangen. Her research interests are manifold. History function of the US-American novel, sure enough, a big topic. Literature and knowledge is one of her preoccupations, autobiographical writing, confessional literature, but she's also interested in transculturality and multi-ethnic literature in the United States. And also she is a theory person in cultural theory, ethics and aesthetics, media history, post-structuralism, feminist and gender studies, you name it. Antje has lots of experience with the format with which we are dealing here. She has successfully applied for and chaired many of the research training programs. One, and that is also an instant for congratulations, was accepted just this year. They started in October 2020. And the title of the program is Literature in the Public Sphere and Contemporary Differentiated Cultures. But before, she was also a member of the DFG Research Training Group, Presence and Tacit Knowledge. Also, before that, Research Training Group Kulturhermeneutik im Zeichen von Differenz und Transdifferenz. And she's also been a member of the Interdisciplinary Research Group on Bio-Objects and Biosubjects. As if it weren't enough, let me go into the academic itinerary, which included many, many stations in Germany and certainly many stations abroad. She studied at the University of Mannheim, English American Studies and German Studies, but she was also at Emory University in Atlanta. She studied women's studies over there and was doing work at the School of Criticism and Theory in Hanover, New Hampshire. She was also a fellow of the German National Academic Foundation. Then subsequent stations got her to Bielefeld, to Mannheim again, to Kiel. She's certainly done the tour of German universities and beyond. In Kiel, Kiel is probably a major station because she completed her postdoctoral degree, the German, or should I say Germanic Habilitation. And since January 2007, she's been professor of North American Literature and Cultural Studies at the FAU Erlangen-Nuremberg. During that time, she made it a preoccupation to travel a lot, to Dartmouth College, for instance, to the Princeton University Library, but she's also contributed to the ways in which a university is run. She was vice president for teaching and student affairs for many years, 2012 until 2018. And all of that did not prevent her from reading, because she was also a recipient of the project Lesezeit, Reading Time, of the Fritz Thyssen Stiftung. And the project title was Death Becomes Us. That is a fairly recent thing, recent in terms of academia, which means 2 years ago, which for me at least is recent. I only focus on the books. I'll leave the articles aside. And the most recent books is, for instance, What Literature Knows. It came out 2018, co-edited with Kai Merten, but she's also done work on rural America that came out in book form, or she's worked on audiences, networks, performances, studies in US media history. And she's also looked into the ways in which we teach our profession. So she's also contributed essays on the pedagogy of studying and the didactics of studying. One of her major research foci, I think, is the knowledge production thing. A recent article came out called Unruly Creatures, Obstinate Things, Bio-Objects and Scientific Knowledge Production in Contemporary Science Novels. That is something, an article that she's written together with Karin Höpker. And what I'm particularly interested, the older I get, is the public humanities things, in putting it differently, in which way do we make what we do relevant or interesting to a larger audience, since we are so much under distress and under threat as a nonprofit kind of academic preoccupation. So a recent article is called Public Humanities and Literary Knowledge, 4 theses on how reading matters for public debate. So print culture, the book, the future of the book has been one of her major preoccupations. And believe me, I could go on, but this is not the purpose. The purpose is that we are very happy to have her here for the second day of our conference. And this morning, she's going to be talking about disruptions in place and time in contemporary US American narratives of the end of life. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Antje Klei.
Thank you so much, Kerstin, for this very generous introduction. It always feels strange to hear these glorified versions of one's academic life, but it sounds great. Anyway, I also want to thank the Research Training Group altogether for inviting me today, and thank you especially to Gustavo Gutierrez, my former student, who extended the invitation to me and kept me informed on all the details of the conference preparation. I think it's been a great event, and I actually do think that my talk fits in well. I wasn't all too sure because these considerations of time and space specifically are a new thing to me, but I've had this hunch that my work on narratives of the end of life would fit in well, and I think it does. But you'll decide once we get there. So without further ado, let me start. In her study of crumbling fantasies of the good life under late capitalist conditions, Cruel Optimism, Lauren Beland observes different kinds of impasse, which people across the planet encounter as, quote, suspended stretches of life and time in the present when one no longer knows what to do or how to live, yet, while unknowing, must adjust, unquote. My talk this morning is concerned with one specific type of impasse that occurs as the experience of death disrupts the grieving subject's social fabric, leaving them, to pick up the title of our conference, neither here nor there, but somewhere in between. That is, bare of the familiar grid that implicitly orients their every move and thought, and needing to adjust to a time space radically different from the one they know. Loss leaves the grieving subject scrambling for their bearings in space and time while developing modes of leave-taking and living with loss. My talk is related to the project that Kerstin has already mentioned, Death Becomes Us, that I've been working on for several years now. The project traces aesthetic negotiations of the social and affective, embodied and relational time spaces of grief in readings of recent US American autobiographical and more explicitly fictional writing on the end of life. The sociologist Deborah Carr, by the way, has recently described the end of life as a time span in its own right, and I should be going on here, a time span in its own right, which thanks to biotechnological developments is frequently quite long, even if accompanied by chronic disease. My project's larger claim is that both autobiographical and more explicitly fictional kinds of writing concerned with encounters of death, that is, with the experiences of dying and grief, are much needed forms of alternative knowledge production to medical, nursing, insurance, and legal discourses. In late capitalist societies, these latter discourses have been the dominant modes of addressing the end of life since the 1980s. Specifically, literary forms of knowledge production draw on, question, connect, and undermine or strengthen disciplinary and systemically specific bodies of knowledge, and they address concerns which, in the present context, occur within medical institutions and the healthcare system, but cannot be fully addressed there. In this sense, I think of literary textuality as a valuable seismograph for what Avril Madrell, the cultural geographer, has called, quote, the mobility of embodied and relational grief, unquote. Literary textuality also functions, I claim, as a source of consolation, or as David James puts it, in a context more generally concerned with the powers of literature, as critical solace. This is a term I will come back to. All of the texts in my corpus, and I'll say something more about the criteria of choice in a minute, converge on a cultural diagnosis triggered by the experience of loss. Namely, that there's an urgent need in current late capitalist societies dedicated to progress, agility, and high performance to rethink autonomous subjectivity in terms of socially embedded embodiment, relationality, and vulnerability. This need is pervasive beyond times of grief, but it is foregrounded in times of loss when the scaffolding of everyday structures and routines falls away. In late capitalist societies, the hospital has become the place where dying frequently takes place. But the medical system, with its dedication to the eradication of disease and cost, is, except for its relatively new branch, palliative care, ill-equipped to meet the needs of dying patients. This predicament is an emblem, I believe, this predicament, this inability or abstraction, this inability to deal with the needs of embodied life, or the abstraction from embodied life, is an emblem, I believe, of a larger problematics inherent in neoliberal life. And I'm using this term neoliberalism or neoliberal life to denote two developments mainly, namely, first of all, the takeover by market logics of public goods like healthcare, education, energy infrastructures, public space, etc., and the saturation of every area of life with the logics of growth, progress, competition, statistical explanation, and the abstraction, not least scientific abstraction, from the concrete, multiple, mobile embeddedness of individual and collective lives. So this just as a footnote to neoliberal life. I see the texts I read participate in exploring and spelling out the contradictions of the neoliberal autonomous subject. And I see them offer consolation to the grieving subject by recognizing their pain and by making it a lens to understanding the larger cultural context in which it occurs. I see them suggest and encourage a rethinking of the autonomous subject that lends credence and consolation to the griever's dislocated existence. To rethink the Enlightenment subject in terms of embodiment, relationality, and vulnerability lends itself well, I believe, and we've been discussing this yesterday, to dynamic conceptions of making place both in its social and its epistemic dimensions. What kind of text do I choose to conduct my exploration? I'm drawn to texts which seek a language different from the popular discourse, which conceives of illness as an enemy to be fought. That's a language that we encounter again and again, both in literary writing and also in medical research, the enemy to be fought and eradicated. The sociologist Hartmut Rosa asserts that, and I quote, "Modernity's relationship to illness is one of pure aggression. Be gone with it. And when we are unable to beat it, we see ourselves as impotent failures," unquote. The autobiography critic Thomas Kuser explains in his 1997 study, Recovering Bodies, that the narrative pattern of the patient's success story and its demand for a positive ending dominates the literary market. He speaks of, quote, "the tyranny of the comic plot," unquote, which marginalizes narratives that do not tell a successful overcoming of illness and the restitution of a previous state of health. I'm looking at examples from the, I believe, not all that marginal and growing body of writing, which does not tell stories of successful overcoming of illness. I'm interested in how these texts focus on the problematics of illness, death, and loss without offering self-help insight. How do they socially emplace individual experiences of loss, and what implications do they develop concerning implicit assumptions about the self, the other, and the planet we'll live on? After these observations on the framing of my talk, let me tell you what I'm planning to do within the next 35 minutes or so. I will introduce you in sections 2 through 4. I should keep on track better here. In sections 2 through 4 to a selection of 6 texts which in various ways trace the collapse of the grieving subject's coordinates in time and social space after learning of imminent death or experiencing the loss of someone close. The texts present protagonists struggling with the incoherent pieces of their former existence as their lives, scandalously, continue in what feels like a timeless wasteland. By introducing these texts to you, I want to point out how they show and enact practices of emplacement. They show or represent social forms of imagining, questioning, making, and altering space. And they enact epistemic practices which probe and configure the meanings of those acts of emplacement. The aesthetic mediation of loss shows and socially frames the protagonist's efforts at orientation in time and space. That is, the representation relates individual patterns of disorientation to the social landscapes in which they occur. As aesthetically self-conscious products, the texts also enact or encourage efforts of emplacement for the reader. Through their aesthetic forms of mediation, the texts invite readers to practice thinking along the lines that these texts sketch out. On a more general level, my readings express and confirm what is as much professional conviction as personal experience. The strength and value of literary writing lies in its potential to socially reconfigure socio-political landscapes which shape questions of what it means to live, thrive, struggle, and die as human beings. The insights generated in literary and cultural studies through careful and slow, close readings of cultural productions and their networks of production and reception provide what the sciences need to relegate to the sidelines: social perspective and the view from somewhere. This is true for such issues as reproductive technologies, insurance and climate risk, distributions of wealth, energy supply and distribution, migration and gene therapy, and in this case, to questions of aging, living with illness, and encountering death. My general take on literary writing also feeds into and is further developed in the context of the recently established research training group that Kerstin has already mentioned on literature and the public sphere in contemporary differentiated cultures at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. In 5 interrelated thematic sections, colleagues from book studies, media studies, sociology, Romance languages, German American, and comparative studies are concerned with contemporary literatures since 1945 in different public and cultural contexts. Assuming that fragmenting publics constitute a relevant context and a prominent concern of literary writing in the present, the research training group seeks to explore the cultural specificities, potentials, and functions of variously positioned literatures and investigates their conditions of emergence and public resonance. In the specific thematic framework I'm concerned with today, I see loss frequently encountered as unspeakable. I see literary narratives of the end of life develop vocabularies for experiences of loss that are frequently encountered as unspeakable. I see them elucidate and enact tentative orientations in time, social, and geographic space. They map the shifting landscapes or the invisible and unspeakable territory of grief, so to speak. To support these claims, I'm going to present my necessarily brief readings in sets of 2 with a focus on the interrelated problematics of language, vulnerability, and relationality. And I come to the first set of readings. The texts in my corpus develop linguistic forms for the experience of one's personal limitations in the encounter with death and processes of grieving. In stops and starts, quietly or loudly, poetically and painfully eloquent, they are in search for ways of giving linguistic form to the social disruption in the wake of the encounter with death that is frequently experienced as unspeakable by those directly or indirectly affected. 2 experimental autobiographical texts serve as my examples here, namely Gail Griffin's Grief's Country, A Memoir in Pieces from 2020, in which the author relates how she, at 57, lost her husband when he collapsed into the Manistee River close to their house in 2008. And Naja Marie Aid's When Death Takes Something From You, Give It Back, Carl's book, published in 2019, the Danish-American poet's literary negotiation of the accidental death of her 25-year-old son. In fragmented forms and iterations, both texts are in search for words and images to articulate the tectonic rift or dislocation in time, space, and the social fabric of a life shaken by loss. Both avoid normative, religious, or psychological ideas of how to deal with grief. They do not define periods or steps of grief or ways of coping. They do not give advice, nor do they suggest socially acceptable patterns of behavior. With their insistent focus on the present, they pay tribute to the experience of a radical plunge in a mourner's everyday social landscape. This story begins with a river, reports the narrator at the beginning of the 2nd chapter of Grief's Country. She speaks in the present tense and thus without narrative distance. A reference to the river also ends the chapter. And I quote, "This story ends with a river." Do I have these quotations? No. "The story ends with a river, but like the river, it doesn't end. It runs on and on," unquote. These 2 sentences, formally framing the story of the accidental death of the narrator's husband, suggest that there's no such thing as framing this event. This logical contradiction is a trace of the dislocations in time and space and of the aporias the text seeks to name as characteristics for the landscapes of grief. In stops and starts, 10 different vignettes attempt to sketch the contours of some new life the narrative protagonist did not choose to live. And I quote, "I am paralyzed in contradiction. It is impossible that this has happened, yet I know this has happened," unquote. The vignettes range from writing tasks to ironic protocols of days spent gaining and losing control, ruminations on the concept of the widow, and a report on temporarily finding the still point of the turning world in a lone blue heron on the coast of northwestern Washington. While observing the blue heron provides a precious and expansive moment of relief for the protagonist, the text does not end there. It resists any teleological notion of bringing grief to a close. Instead, it foregrounds grief's claim on the narrative protagonist's sense of location and self. Along these lines, the text ends on the act of breathing, and I quote, "In a voice that is sometimes like his, her husband's, absence whispers its name, breathe. So that is what I do." End of quote. Mapping the protagonist's grief onto the social and geographical landscapes in which she moves, the text also traces how enormous the task of charting the territory feels to the protagonist. And I quote again, "This grief is a beast I must ride where it takes me, and I must learn to live where it drops me. The fantasy of self-creation, so youthful, so American, has met its death blow. Profound grief is a formidable force. Like a storm, it reshapes the landscape. I will have to live it out and see what I have to work with." Unquote. In the middle of a storm, the protagonist in this passage perceives herself ride and being ridden by a beast, an unfamiliar force that might drop her at any point in time and space in the middle of an unrecognizable landscape she will have to navigate. In comparison with this figure, the popular entrepreneurial concept of the self-reliant subject who is master of her own devices appears merely a leftover figment of a former delusion. Vividly imagining and acknowledging the disruptions, the leaden emptiness, and the contradictions attendant upon the experience of loss, Grief's Country provides what David James has called critical solace, not a comforting patch or an act of repair, but an active and unruly solace of depiction, registering and articulating pain rather than setting out to undo it. Critical solace to James is not, quote, an expedient sedative or a mollifying gesture, unquote. It's not, quote, mere distraction, appeasement, and soothing repair, unquote. James argues that lucid fictional description might perform, quote, a double act, shirking its mimetic duties so as to reckon with what it shows, unquote. This double act offers resources for, and I quote again, rethinking one's relation to misfortune, unquote. It confronts the reader with her own or his own implication and entanglements in what she or he reads, and thus offers resonance and a discrepant version of amelioration. In Aid's text too, the dimension of time loses its meaning, and so does space, do objects, concepts, excitements, tasks, and the self. Language also loses its power to shape reality as the narrator seeks to leave written traces against losing her mind. The text seems wrought from an overwhelming sense of meaninglessness. I want to show you two examples which both chronicle the threat of language dissolving its powers and poetically pay tribute to the practical necessity of language. And this is one of the contradictions that I find so indicative in these texts for the experience of loss. No language possible. Language died with my child, could not be artistic, could not be art, did not want to be fucking art. I vomit over art, over syntax, write like a child, main clauses. Searching everything, I write as a declaration. I hate writing, don't want to write anymore. I'm writing burning hate. My anger is useless, a howling cry. I'm loaded with bullets. No one should come to me with their soft shit. And here's a second example. Further along in the book, and I quote, "Nothing is real. Language is emptied of meaning. Shock language. How are you doing now? A little better. Have you had any sleep at all? Yes, I slept a little." Quote marks are necessary for describing the new reality, the no reality, the one we suddenly find ourselves in, a state of emergency where nothing ordinary resonates or can be established, where nothing in the entire world is recognizable. And the passage continues. The use of quote marks unleashes spontaneous laughter, and the laughter gives brief moments of ease. Redemption. Should we try to eat now? Should we go for a walk? We can only talk with an extreme use of quotation marks. It becomes our code, a way to express the impossible, the state, the unthinkable. Are you okay? We use our hands to show this cryptic effacing sign, these constantly fluttering hands around the empty words, which give the empty words some sort of meaning. End of quote. For the grieving group of Carl's family and friends, what was yesterday feels like masquerade. The only thing that they find helpful in the midst of their pain-filled emptiness, bereft of speech, action, and identity, are other people who do nothing but share their painful emptiness. In fleeting sketches, the text anachronistically assembles various fragments into an inadvertent poem while it moves, but from the news of the narrative son's accident to his clinically diagnosed brain death 28 hours later. Both Aid's and Griffin's texts pose fundamental questions concerning the narrative protagonist's implicit assumptions about themselves, about those around them, and about contemporary late capitalist societies more generally. The literary confrontation with individual mortality and the general vulnerability of life moves the radically unfamiliar and unprecedented center stage and alienates what seems all too self-evident. The apparently inevitable everyday striving towards efficient, optimized, and profitable visions of the future proves much less reliable than its reputation suggests. Under the sign of death, economically based logics of acceleration, multiplication, and gain seem unreal at best. Instead, Griffin's and Aid's texts articulate the need for a different quality of relation to the world, urgently experienced by both narrative protagonists. A relation to the world that is in tune, or as the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa would put it, in resonance with individual and collective needs. There is no systematic space, however, for this kind of relation to the planet and for an ethics of vulnerability, as the philosopher Ralf Schnell develops it, within the strict logics of economic progress and growth. With their aesthetic strategies, the texts introduced here seek to articulate the contradictions that arise for the survivors from the scandalous fact that life goes on. Both texts present characters who find themselves wondering how they can function at all, even though the world has suddenly become fundamentally different and strange to them. Articulating these contradictions, the texts imaginarily open up room for a more visceral and bodily sensitive relation to the world and invite readers to join and expand and strengthen the force of that imagination. For brief moments at least, the texts may prompt their readers to put into perspective and defer or expand their unexamined conceptions of normal life. Steering clear of a rhetoric of personal development or heroic overcoming of pain and grief, both texts sketch the contours of a radically contingent future, and they imagine these contours with all their contradictions as equally volatile and necessary points of reference. Literary forms of knowledge production about death meet an acute need, in particular in highly competitive late capitalist societies, to converge professionally differentiated discourses on body and mind, experience, and empirical science. They carefully unpack the meanings of human vulnerability and mortality in all their implications. As examples, I want to draw on two texts published in 2016. Both articulate the vulnerability of human lives in linguistically sensitive ways, and they eloquently critique the deeply anchored and widely performed striving for unconditional control. And that is Paul Kalanithy's autopathography, When Breath Becomes Air, a text that has been a bestseller and has been translated in over 40 languages. So it's really been a widely read book. And Don DeLillo's novel, Zero K. And I'll begin with Kalanithy. With its 37-year-old protagonist, who's both a successful neurosurgeon and a fatally ill lung cancer patient, When Breath Becomes Air stages the connection between dying and a highly technologized hospital culture as a fundamental misfit. The text foregrounds the aporias between the healthcare system and the needs of fatally ill patients. With its juxtaposition of the control of disease and cost built into the medical system on the one hand, and the needs of acutely vulnerable embodied subjects for recognition, physical and emotional support on the other, the text mediates a visceral impression of how little the healthcare system is equipped to adopt the dying patient's perspective. The text deflates ideas of control, coded in the text as masculine, healthy, and strong, and it shores up qualities which allow the patient to accept, however tentatively, his own mortality, vulnerability, solidarity, and the relationality of knowledge, of his own research, of friendship, and of life. Don DeLillo's linguistically clipped but powerful novel, Zero K, is a fictional discussion of the human wish to control death. The novel employs the idea of bringing death under control as an analytic lens to articulate Western late modernity's consumerist fantasies of technological control and its rising fear but weak grasp of its own precarious predicament. Zero K projects a near future scenario in which wealthy customers may choose a cryostatic suspension of death in order to profit from future medical advance. The novel's plot unfolds as a 60-year-old billionaire plans to be cryopreserved together with his terminally ill wife in a remote compound somewhere in an unspecified desert area within the territory of the former Soviet Union. He asks, the billionaire asks his estranged son, the novel's narrator, to join him at the remote necropolis, for which he's also a major investor. As the son prepares to bid an uncomfortable farewell to his father and stepmother, he struggles with the deformative dimensions of technological optimization. Through his coolly analytical and perceptive perspective, the novel presents the attempt to own immortality as fundamentally asocial. It figures as the epitome of the logic of late capitalism and the neoliberal neglect of life. At the same time, the novel renders the acknowledgement of the radical uncontrollability of death and the pain of loss as necessary to human flourishing. Both novels emplace human lives as precarious and in need of relation for sustenance. The vulnerability of texts, the vulnerability both texts present as constitutive for individual and collective flourishing is not a weakness that calls for protection. It is presented as a general condition which precedes notions of strength and weakness. Such diverse critics as the feminist philosopher Elizabeth Grosz, the psychologist Kenneth Gergen, the cultural critic Judith Butler, and the social philosopher Martin Schnell have articulated conceptions of vulnerability which place the porous and interdependent quality of bodily and social life center stage. The African American studies scholar Joseph Winters also fleshes out vulnerability as receptivity to the signs of the past and the present, and to the ways they affect us economically, socially, and emotionally. The corona pandemic underlines once again how adequate these new and more general conceptions of vulnerability are. The pandemic has confronted people worldwide with a disruptive force of infectious diseases and with their own mortality. The pandemic and the infringements of civil life in its wake have brought into focus the fragility of life, of relations and communities, and of the state, as much as the fact that people are dependent on each other, in particular in the face of uncertainty. In projections of imaginary worlds, one of them very close to the author's own life, Kalanithi text, and the other more purely fictional, DeLillo's text, they both shed light on the spatial, economic, and relational dependencies of vulnerable lives. As literary forms of knowledge production, the text's imaginary projections thus offer acts of epistemic emplacement to the reader. Many texts in my corpus address not only the individual and mostly lonely experience of loss, but also the more immediate as well as the wider social context in which subjects die and grieve. Like Aitz and Griffin's autobiographical work that I introduced in section 2, the novels Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders and Afterlife by Julia Alvarez, published in 2020. Lincoln in the Bardo was published in 2017. Draw up intricate cartographies of the landscapes of grief. While Griffin's and Aitz's texts also insisted on revising, that didn't work. While Griffin's and Aitz's texts also insisted on revising the relation between singularity and sociality, pointing out the human need for community, not only but especially in times of grief, Saunders and Alvarez's novels focus more strongly on the connections and emplacements of the grievers. Afterlife confronts the monsters of loss from the perspective of the bereaved widow Antonia in two social directions, into the directions of a young immigrant couple from Mexico without legal papers in predominantly white and politically divided Vermont, and to the perspective of Antonia's older sister who suffers from a long undiagnosed bipolar disease and vanishes into isolation, eventually taking her own life. In different ways, Antonia, her sister, and the immigrant couple all face, quote, the outer edge, that's not here on here, the outer edge where in old maps, the world drops off and beyond is terra incognita, sea serpents, the Leviathan. Here, there be dragons, unquote. Antonia learns to navigate the landscapes of her own widowhood and more generally of life after loss in confrontation with her own dragons as much as with those of the people around her. The novel opens with an experimental 2-page dialogue entitled Broken English, prologue entitled Broken English, which ends abruptly with the protagonist's need to create an afterlife for her husband who had died in his car 9 months earlier, suffering a ruptured aortic aneurysm. Without any other punctuation except for a few commas and several question marks, slashes separate phrases thought or said by either Antonia or her husband Sam, or the covert third-person narrator focalizing Antonia on the day of her husband's death, and 9 months later looking back, then Sam minutes before his death. Right in this brief prologue, Afterlife thus also establishes the sense of displacement in time and space I identified in the two autobiographies as characteristic of the encounter with death. The prologue makes it hard to tell which one of the different voices is actually speaking at any one time. Rerunning that night, 9 months later, for the umpteenth time, Antonia still remembers describing Sam's features on the phone to the hospital and to the police as if it were minutes ago. Antonia is left behind in the midst of a new life she envisioned differently, wondering how her husband, quote, can be nothing but dust, unread emails, fragments, unpaid bills, memories, broken glass, dented bumper, a new life awaiting her, both terrified and excited. How can it be? Can you help me find him? A mystery she cannot by any means solve. Nevertheless, she keeps asking, where are you? As this is the only way she knows. Can you help me find him? How to create an afterlife for him. Unquote. 9 months after her husband's sudden death, Antonia sees the new life she's inadvertently called upon to create in his absence, intimately tied to his ghostly presence. She feels the need to clarify her relation to this monstrous absence, to create an afterlife for him, as she puts it, in order for her new life to take shape. Antonia's idea that seeing oneself in relation to the dead might allow the survivor to go on also connects individual and collective ways of addressing trauma. Antonia finds it increasingly difficult and even suspicious to separate her own concerns from those of others. The novel doesn't hide or resolve the tensions connected to this opening out of one's own concerns to those of family, neighbors, and the planet. But the text articulates a suggestion by setting up the voice of an Earth Day speaker at a campus rally as speaking to the novel's most pressing concerns, namely, first, to the question of how to live the only mortal life one is sure to have. Secondly, the connection of individual and collective concerns. And thirdly, the vital role of language, metaphor, and story for the projection of a future. So equipped with the authority of his speech being set up in this way in the novel, the speaker claims, and I quote, "We have to live as if, in other words, by metaphor," unquote. In conclusion, Antonia suggests that, quote, "She must live as if Sam, as if Izzy, as if her parents, Tios, as if the list of losses goes on and on, as if it matters to them that Antonia not fall into one of her moods and join them," unquote. Reaffirming the mending of fragments into something new as powerful, the novel's epilogue champions the Japanese repair technique of kintsugi. The technique doesn't seek to hide where an object has been broken, but emphasizes the cracks with fine golden lining. Quote, "The gold intersecting grid showing where it has been broken," unquote. Imagining her own life after Sam as intimately intertwined with his afterlife, with a choice of Sam's beliefs and qualities, but also emplacing it in the experience of her family life, of immediate close range, as well as more mediated global social connections, Antonia finds herself strengthened into gathering up and mending the motley pieces she has broken and touched upon in her plunge. Lincoln in the Bardo also connects a private experience of grief, the president's, with its social, cultural, and historical emplacements in the context of the ongoing Civil War. In 2 parts and 108 short dialogical chapters, the novel assembles documentary and fictional voices, partly fantastically grotesque ones, around the death of President Lincoln's 11-year-old son, Willie, who in February 1862 succumbs to typhoid fever. The night after the burial, the president visits his son 3 times, and all the novel's cacophonic voices are assembled around those visits. An estimated quarter of the chapters assemble individual lines or small passages from several frequently contradictory news reports, obituaries, popular or historical accounts from different time periods. They serve to anchor the fictional events within the historical present, and they document the multiplicity of contradictory voices in both contemporary reporting and later evaluation. Next to these historical fragments, we meet a number of fantastic figures in the majority of fictional chapters, introducing the reader to the world of the bardo, somewhere between the worlds of the living and the dead. Buried in Georgetown Cemetery, Willie Lincoln thus finds himself, to the excitement of the entire community, in the company of a motley crew of undead people. The qualities of the bardo are never explained in the novel, and the reader only slowly gathers information about this place in passing. The fantastic inhabitants of the bardo deny or cannot account for what has happened to them in the previous place. Willie observes at one point that they are all overwhelmed by sadness. And I quote, "None were content, all had been wronged, neglected, overlooked, misunderstood," unquote. This is one reason why they're so taken with President Lincoln's tender attention to the dead form of his son. Despite the transgressions that frequently take place in the bardo, the nation's racial divisions seem strangely uncontested in the first part of the book. The bardo assumes the function of a grotesque but telling mirror image of the nation. At the same time, the way the characters constantly connect and refer to each other through reporting each other's words and actions counteracts their unquestioned engagement of processes of othering. So they do other people, but at the same time, they can only report what others report, or their own thoughts have to be told by other characters. So it's this strange interdependence in the narrative that counteracts this practice of othering that they engage in. This mode of reporting and referring to each other also prefigures the fantastic cohabitations taking place throughout the novel. Both the collective narration and the cohabitations figure as fantastic modes of imagining life as porous, as Butler would have it, placing the individual as emergent from social relation. In a similar as-if construction, as we've seen in Alvarez's novel, the equally broken and highly authoritative figure of Lincoln concludes that in the face of profound uncertainty, he must, in the name of all Americans, act as if his son could possibly give him the blessing to, quote, end suffering by causing more suffering, unquote. In very different ways, Antonia in Afterlife and the President in Lincoln in the Bardo are in free fall after the deaths of their husband and son, respectively. But both of them still enjoy social, cultural, and economic privileges that many, or in the case of Lincoln, most of the people around them do not have. Both grievers are presented as broken figures and far from heroic in their suffering. Neither of them reaches any special kind of cognitive insight. Antonia attempts to shun the responsibilities connected to her roles as sister and neighbor, and Lincoln cannot even speak. Other characters have to lend their thoughts, have to lend his thoughts and feelings a voice. Both feel inadequate to the tasks ahead of them, but they inhabit social positionalities that require and enable them to take responsibility for the social structures which have placed them where they are in the first place. In different ways, Afterlife and Lincoln in the Bardo connect individual experiences of grief with collective social histories and the address of grievances implied in them, in particular in connection with systemic denials of life through slavery, racism, and xenophobia. Both texts insist that individual and collective negotiations of vulnerability and mortality require putting into relation the past and the present. This temporal relationality needs to both recognize past grievances and produce generative narratives other than the romance of progress. And I come to my conclusion. The texts I talked about are not individual phenomena. They are part of a larger cultural trend in late capitalist societies, a trend Thomas Macho and Christine Marek have called the new cultural visibility of death. Now, clearly, death is not a new topic. It's hardly a new topic, but cultural productions of the last 3 or 4 decades in all media increasingly address death, illness, dying, and grief. Think of the AIDS quilt, TV series like 6 Feet Under, Gunther von Hagen's Body Worlds exhibitions, and digital practices of commemoration. There are comic books, novels, poems, plays, films concerned with death and the reintroduction of the reality principle that it implies. Clearly, the new cultural visibility of death emerges in unresolved tension with, and possibly as a reaction to, the spatial, emotional, and cognitive repression of dying and of the loss of control it implies, that have, as the French historian Philippe Ariès has explained in his 1973 study, Western Attitudes Toward Death, been firmly entrenched in Western societies since the late 19th century. With the repression of death and with the decline of widely shared religious beliefs in the global North, practices of consoling grief have also vanished. Consolation has dropped off the cultural radar, as the cultural geographers Christoph Jaden, Avril Madrell, and Eric von Breu put it bluntly in their recent volume entitled Consolationscapes in the Face of Loss, in which they bring a spatial lens to an interdisciplinary study of consolation practices across the globe. As the American psychologist Pauline Boss has shown in her empirical work over the past almost 50 years, this is especially true for US America. Through the history of slavery, war, deeply rooted racist structures, and currently the corona pandemic, American society is, she argues, highly burdened by unresolved grief. She speaks of ambiguous loss, of individually and collectively unaddressed grief in a society which primarily values success and making things happen. Considering the social repression of death and the diminished integrative force of widely shared institutional religious belief, cultural productions which offer an aesthetic reflection on the vulnerability of life and the experience of death perform an important form of alternative knowledge production to medical, nursing, legal, and insurance discourses. Because cultural productions can discuss the multi-layered needs and philosophical implications of the fact that we all die more poignantly, more multivocally, and more exemplarily and bracingly than these other discourses. My research indicates that the concurrence in the past few decades of the social repression of death on the one hand and the proliferation of new cultural figurations of death on the other are signs of an ongoing recalibration of the social meaning of death. I see this recalibration in close connection with biomedical development since the end of World War II and its promise to understand, order, and control the phenomena of life. On the one hand, people who have access to the technologized medical system grow much older than they used to and have less immediate contact with death. At the same time, chronic diseases, which do not prove immediately fatal, but proliferate the visceral experience of the general fragility of life, spread among the elder population in particular. Research in sociology and medical ethics also has shown that since the 1980s, the hospital has become the primary location in which dying takes place. Spatially and psychologically repressed, death reemerges most directly and most forcefully in all its personal and cultural complexity in the highly technologized hospital system, which is geared toward the control of disease and cost. With this systemic focus, the medical system and the hospital are ill-equipped, however, to actually be with patients during the personally and culturally conflicting process of dying. The journalist Barbara Ehrenreich therefore criticizes the medicalization of dying for the disregard of the actual needs of patients that it implies. And Paul Kalanithi confirms in his autobiography, quote, the questions intersecting life, death, and meaning, questions that all people face at some point, usually arise in a medical context, unquote. Negotiating these questions, he continues, is at least as much a philosophical as a medical practice. The medical system, however, is not equipped to dedicate itself to the well-being of patients and their philosophical questions concerning the meaning of life and death on top of strictly medical issues. Only on the margins of the system, in palliative care and in medical ethics, does a less competitive and more supportive perspective on the human body and its needs take hold. My project, Death Becomes Us, argues that literature and the arts in general are an important public arena in which this negotiation of the meaning of life and death can and must take place. And I thank you for your attention.
My thanks goes to you, Etienne, for truly interdisciplinary topic that bordered in sociology, literary studies, humanities, philosophies at large, and that, well, in every kind of way concerns us all. I can see that the air is teeming with questions. And oh, yes.